Professor Darity for a very thought-provoking talk that I'm sure is going to invite a lot of questions. I have quite a few myself, but we can take that off. I don't want to take up the time. Professor Simon, as you can see, has built quite a reputation in doing introductions and biographies of other speakers and presenters. I hope they don't hitch Professor Torber to Barbara Stanwyck and, what is it, the Big Valley? I don't know what you're referring to, quite honestly, given in my age, but please don't send me to google.org, the company doesn't do it. But it is my distinct pleasure to at least give you a brief introduction to the man that created this center, because this is an iteration of a long set of creations that he's been responsible for. He is the founder and longtime director of arguably the first MA program in Sustainable International Development in the North American continent, and perhaps the Anglo-American world. That's built quite a reputation. We're in our 20th year. He recently has transitioned to becoming the founder of a research center in global development sustainability, which is what you're seeing here today. In between, the man has had several major accomplishments in his life that it would be hard for one of us to just one of these things in our lifetime. But a substantial history at Oxfam America, the UNDP, and the World Bank. As we'll hear today, his roots really begin in Latin America in the late 60s and early 70s. I'll be speaking about that as well with regard to liberation theology. And so we're talking about an individual that's crossed space and time. And as we honored him 2 years ago, I'd say the defining feature of his thinking and his achievements is compassion. He was the founder of American Jewish World Service, which is a major institution today that sends young people around the world engaged in compassionate, selfless service. And I do believe that that's what runs through his thinking and his work. He's the only academic leader that I know that begins an inaugural lecture to every entering class mentioning authentically the word love. So as a transition to his presentation, please give a warm welcome to Professor Laurence.
Thank you, Raj. That was very kind of you. So I'm going to talk about, obviously, Dr. Ambedkar, who I still know very little about, although I am now reading the collected works which are on my bookshelf of, what is it, about 30 volumes or something that Dr. Thorpe presented me with. I'm plowing through them. And of course, I'm going to try to talk about also a man that had influenced me tremendously in my early years in Latin America, the Brazilian social theorist Paulo Freire. So a couple of years ago, I found myself in Chennai and being taken out to visit with a kind of on the outskirts of the city, a Dalit training center run by an organization called the Foundation of His Sacred Majesty. This is a group that works against untouchability in that part of India. And I was quite surprised that there on the wall, well, I wasn't surprised to see Dr. Ambedkar's photograph on the wall, of course. I was very surprised to see the photograph of Paulo Freire right there on the wall next to Ambedkar's. There were about 30 women in the room, sitting on the floor to meet with me, to greet me. I wasn't expecting to say anything, but I was asked by one of the leaders who had brought me out there to speak a little bit about Freire. They knew nothing about Freire. They really had no knowledge what that photograph even was. But as I began to talk about Freire's ideas, you can see that they understood the connection immediately to the thought of the great thinker and the great Dalit intellectual, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So Freire and Ambedkar were towering figures among radical social theorists of the last century. While Ambedkar is largely unknown outside of India, I think that's still fair to say, outside of the Indian community and those that study India, I have found that Freire is still respected in India, particularly among social activists and by Catholic clergy that I have met with. But these leaders do not have a close knowledge of his ideas or his relevance to their situation. He's still something more of an icon for kind of radical social change. Instead, they rightly look, of course, to Ambedkar for their path to liberation. Now, years after both their deaths, Ambedkar and Frere's renown in the developing world remained iconic, particularly among oppressed groups fighting for recognition and social justice. While they were of different generations and emerged from communities of suffering halfway around the world from each other, their thought and praxis deserve comparative analysis, asking the relevance of their ideas to the rapidly changing and globalizing world of the poor and to the present notions of justice and human rights that permeate poor nations much more today than in their formative years. For both thinkers, freedom is a personal and social transformation affecting not only the oppressed but the oppressor in a quest for a common humanity. Yet difference of context and culture imbue their work, and these differences may yield perhaps some lessons for the struggles ahead, particularly the role that religious movements play for liberation or for oppression. With millions of others still stigmatized by untouchability, dehumanized and largely cut off from the globalizing economy and norms of justice, paths to full emancipation seem to be still blocked. Frere's pedagogy of education, creating spaces where concepts of justice and hope emerge and are sustained, might be a help to some in India. These ideas find a fertile ground largely because of their consistency with the thought of Dr. Ambedkar. So let's talk for a few moments about Frere and his world. The Latin America of Frere's youth, and I might add when I first went to work in Latin America was still characterized as oligarchic and feudal, an economic apartheid based partly on the fiction of race and partly on the pursuit of selfish control and accumulation. The deep oppression for centuries had robbed the masses of the poor of that part of their humanity that strove for freedom. Poverty is hard work, as Frere said. It's debilitating, he said. They cannot spontaneously lift themselves out of poverty, as it was the end result of hundreds of years of oppression with its roots now intertwined in the very fabric of society, deeply burrowed into the culture and reinforced with long histories of exploitation, of land grabs, marginalization, intimidation, indoctrination, reinforcing inferiority and isolation. And the dominant cultural institution of the time in Latin America, the Catholic Church, itself rose in Latin America with the conquistadors, and with some notable exceptions, gave divine blessing to the rape of the Indian people and their land, and the church grew obese and lifeless through its association and dependency on the oligarchs of the era. And the dispossessed knew their place. For place is both a spatial and a psychological dimension of human awareness. What if that awareness was embedded in a reality unchanging and deterministic, psychologically isolating, where history is fixed, time measured, not by the unfolding of greater freedom, but only by the cyclical nature of the seasons and the cycle of birth and death, where generosity is defined, as I myself have seen, as the hacienda owner donating a child's casket to the family of an exploited cane cutter. Frere calls that, of course, false generosity. Frere's work was centered on the notion that those oppressions created a psychological isolation among the poor, created a view of themselves outside of history, where nature and culture were confused, where the concept of social justice could not even penetrate. For the great Archbishop of the northeast of Brazil, Helder Câmara, once told me that when he first became Archbishop, he went out to meet his people throughout many rural communities, and he would ask them one basic question, knowing how high infant and child mortality was in those years. why is it that so many of your children die? And he said that he heard the same answer from village to village, Monsignor, this is the way God made the world. Helder, like other progressive bishops and increasingly thousands of priests and sisters throughout the continent, did not believe that God made the world like this. And they rolled up their sleeves to begin the long work of changing the consciousness of the poor through what Freire called conscientization. And I once heard a dialogue actually in Philadelphia between Mother Teresa and Helder. Mother Teresa spoke of the need for charity, and she spoke with great humility, described her truly extraordinary work with the poor and dying. And Helder, a very gentle man, and with the gentlest of rebukes to her, spoke of a higher calling than charity, to understand and change the underlying structures of society that create and sustain poverty and death from wholly preventable disease. Throughout Latin America, the church began to free its own mind of the devastating myth of its own making, that they were there to usher the flock to an eternal life in heaven and not to address the social pathology of the day. It was a very different church that chose what they called the preferential option for the poor at the Medellin Conference of Latin American Bishops in 1968, a culmination that finally broke with the oligarchs and unleashed the movement of liberation theology. That social movement would aim to unshackle the minds of the poor so that they could guide their own development. Freire said, "It is thwarted by the injustice, exploitation, oppression, and violence of the oppressors. It is affirmed by the yearning of the oppressed for freedom and justice, and by their struggles to recover their lost humanity." And halfway around the world, and decades before Freire uttered those words, another great leader put it this way: "Ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. It is a battle for freedom. It is a battle for reclamation of human personality." Those were, of course, the words of Dr. Ambedkar. Those who worry about the consequences of this kind of consciousness raising, this conscientization, believe it is an indoctrination into a radical political philosophy. In their fear, they replace faith in the powers of enlightenment with a fear of anarchy, or even the fear of vengeance against those who kept the minds of the poor enslaved and their bodies in servitude. Instead of leading to a destructive fanaticism, Freire presents us with a theory of change that is based on self-affirmation and the triumph of love. An affirmation and a love that needs to encompass not only the oppressed, but the oppressor too. We had the privilege here a few months ago, Raj and I and others, to host the visit of Father Gustavo Gutierrez, whose writings and teachings were the foundation of the seismic shift of the Latin American Catholic Church, one of the greatest and most compassionate figures in our history, a genuinely holy man, I think. Gutierrez has written, "But the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct," he said, "of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor, and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order." Gutierrez understood the spirituality of anguish. He understood the sad humility of the poor, a humility founded in stumbling on the debilitating effects of deep and seemingly unending poverty. For Freire and Gutierrez alike, freedom is a personal and social transformation of Wagnerian proportions, affecting not only the oppressed but all others in society whose lives are intertwined with the poor. The dialectic of freedom engages all. The dialectic is a logic that bears false beliefs and embraces new truths about being truly human. It is the feminine dialecticos of conversation, a true dialogue. For a genuine dialogue to emerge, it must challenge the peripheral dependent poor as well as the rich and powerful to embrace a greater freedom than the relative security each knows in both dependency and control. For Freire, liberation theology became an ally through the tens of thousands of base Christian communities in Latin America, where the poor formed Bible study groups that gave them courage that Jesus was a liberator of the poor. For Ambedkar, Brahmin Hinduism, with its defense of caste, was the oppressor, and I don't think he could find a theology of liberation within it. In contrast to the liberation theology that grew from the social gospel of Catholicism, Ambedkar confronted the dominant religious culture of India, Brahmin Hinduism, for creating and perpetuating the suffering of low caste and Dalit people and subjugating them to the deepest discriminations that flow from the so-called eternal laws of Manu, the order of caste-based society. While epochs changed, Brahmanism did not. While universal norms of human rights emerged, Dalits were caught in what Freire might call a psychological isolation, that, like Freire's analysis of the Pernambuco, the state that he grew up in Brazil, the Pernambuco of his time was, in his opinion, ahistorical, without personal agency or even notions of justice. The situation of Dalits was much like the poor of the northeast of Brazil, where the inconvenient truth was buried beneath centuries of myth that God created a natural hierarchy, that the poor would always be with us, not because they were exploited, but because they were needed to be poor. Liberation theology was like a Copernican revolution that toppled the Ptolemaic view of the universe, where God created earth as the center of his creation. Liberation theology overthrew a closed system of social thought that was dogma, not science, where the accident of birth was conflated with the hereditary rights of elites, where, as the poet William Blake once sung, every night and every morn some to misery are born. Every morn and every night some are born to sweet delight, some are born to sweet delight, some are born to endless night. Determinism characterized both the poor of Pernambuco and of India. For in Brahmin Hinduism, with its belief in a closed system of thought, reincarnation based on karma justified the birth into untouchability. If you believe that God made the world like this, or that Manu created an eternal caste system, concepts of justice would appear irrelevant. Worse, they make no sense at all. For I'm sure that generations ago, Dalit elders would have described their lives as miserable, but to ask if it was unjust, you might have been met with the silence of the lambs going to their slaughter. For justice and untouchability are totally and thoroughly foreign to each other. For if you believe that you were born into untouchability for prior wrongs in an earlier life, you must accept the reality you yourself have created. And Ambedkar chose a more radical, and if I might characterize it, a Freudian path. I would call Freire's work an Ambedkite path. For in 1956, Ambedkar announced to the world, as you all know, that since Brahmin Hinduism would not allow a path to liberation for his people, he would just stop being a Hindu. He converted to Buddhism, which does not have untouchability, and hundreds of thousands of Dalits showed up for a mass conversion. This ceremony was the most powerful act of conscientization in Indian history, perhaps in all history. It is almost unimaginable to me how profound an act it was to liberate oneself from the deepest of oppressive identities, to change historic epochs in the mere utterance of 22 vows of Buddhism, to emerge a new man and a new woman able to see the difference between culture and nature, between social construct and social contract. This great act of conscientization culminated in Ambedkar's efforts for the liberation of his people, where he died I believe it was 7 weeks later. Assuredly, he did not expect that conversion would free Dalits of all oppression, for they still lived enveloped in a social reality that did not acknowledge or nurture their liberation. We've heard at this symposium of the continuing discrimination not only of low-caste Hindus, but by low-caste Hindus of their brothers and sisters who are just a mite lower than they. Frantz Fanon called this the internalization of oppression. Freire called it the adhesion of the oppressed to the image of the oppressor. They carry their untouchability like parasites in their blood. But Freire would say that Ambedkar's legacy is unfinished, even with the progress that some have made today. They still live in a social reality that develops them and are subject to the tyranny of place and the simple need to survive. Freire talks about the utter exhaustion of immersion in deep poverty and how the structure of domination embeds itself into the very personality of the poor. The pedagogy of the oppressed requires a rebirth to shed the identity imposed upon them. He speaks of the cognitive bias of economic elites who live in the convenient myths of their own superiority. The pedagogy of the oppressed requires a rebirth of the oppressor too, to shed the identity imposed upon them also by their accident of birth. So we need to think about how their rebirth comes about, perhaps within their own hearts and minds and within their own process of conscientization. You know, I read yesterday, literally yesterday, as I was preparing these notes, about a man in India who died some years ago. Maybe some of you would know his name. I did not. Naren Gorapati. Nobody knows. Does any of you do? Okay. I don't know much about him. But the article said, and just going to quote a paragraph, Naren was born, and he had died, what, about 5 years ago or something like that, right? But this was an article I just read. Naren was born into a family of landlords. His father, unwilling to alter the rules of caste observed in the village, was against allowing Dalits to enter the kitchen or sit with them at the table. Naren, too, was stubborn, but in a gentle way. The solution he crafted was uniquely Naren's. In all the years that he lived in the village while his father was alive, he ate his food on the kitchen table. He ate his food on the kitchen floor, not at the dining table, and when there were Dalit visitors, they ate with him on the floor. His wife and 2 young daughters joined him in this practice. Naren would sit with his father at the table when he had his meals, but not eat at the table himself. Later, he would sit on the floor with his food. This was Naren's daily satyagraha, is that how you pronounce it, for social equality at home. Maybe great social change begins with simple acts like this. The shedding of old ways, the embrace of a common humanity. All social movements against poverty must embrace humanization, as Freire said, as an inescapable concern. For humanization is not like a river coursing toward its delta, or an inevitable unfolding of history toward a greater glory. Humanization is just a potential that is present in every human being, but is dormant in some and is suppressed in many by economic and political processes that rob that potential of its vitality. But Freire warns that humanization must first begin with an understanding of dehumanization. Dehumanization is possible because we are conditioned through our particular histories to accept as ordinary the varying manifestations of power and to turn a blind eye to the impacts of powerlessness. Some are born to accumulation and some to dispossession, some to security and others to vulnerability, some to the full panoply of power and some to its disgrace. Dehumanization makes the job of humanization difficult. We must be cautious that the weak do not take on the same characteristics of their oppressors, for dehumanization and injustice are hammered on the same anvil. Dehumanization for Freire is the distortion of the vocation of becoming. It may be a distortion within history, but it is not an historical vocation. That is, it is not consistent with the rising consciousness of all societies, despite the lunatic fringe of fundamentalism today, toward rights and obligations, toward nurturing rather than suppression, and toward compassion and empathy. The vocation of humanization has a deeper and epoch-changing ambition, Ferry says. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. In one of the most remarkable passages in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he says, "Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both." But what a conundrum this presents. How does power emerge out of weakness, and how do the weak harness that power to free not only themselves, but to create new relationships that protect and nurture a comprehensive and integrated freedom? Humanization begins with the yearning of the oppressed to recover their lost humanity. And Ambedkar certainly agrees, for he said, "For ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. It is a battle for freedom. It is the battle of reclamation of human personality." And I think Freire would just add, it is a battle of reclamation of human personality for both the oppressed and the oppressor too. Thank you.